Yay! Back when the GameCube was floundering in sales, Capcom unveiled 5 titles that would try to save the GameCube from complete loss of the generation. These 5 titles would be known as the Capcom 5, and I can talk about that subject later if anyone really wants me to. But for today, I'm going to talk about the crown jewel of the Capcom 5, Resident Evil 4. It should be noted though that this is the PS3 HD re-release that I'm reviewing, just due to availability. Now with that in mind, let's get into it. You play as Leon Kennedy. After having lost his position as a police officer and gotten his hair cut, he has become a member of an elite American Special Task Force. What? Okay, first off, the only thing that losing your position as a police officer within the first day entitles you to would maybe make you qualified to be the 4th character in a Streets of Rage game, rather than that stupid god-awful kangaroo. Second, why the hell would anyone think it'd be a good idea to give this guy a job of such high military importance if he can't hold down a basic police job? Finally, why on earth would they get this guy to operate in the field alone? I would have like 20 other way more qualified guys holding his leash on site just so he doesn't shoot everyone. Anyway, Leon is sent into the middle of nowhere in Spain to rescue the president's daughter from an evil parasite-ridden group of cultists, because honestly, they needed something to drive the plot, and it certainly wasn't going to be Leon's hair, although I think that would probably be an equally valid plot point. Most of the backstory though is explored through notes, similar to the older Resident Evil games. It's a pretty cool way of telling the story, and it just sort of gives you some insight in what's going on, rather than just through Leon's eyes. The conveyance of mechanics is poor. You'll learn all of the controls through these obnoxious pop-up menus, and at least for the bulk of them, they all come in one, which is overloading way too much information all at once. In addition, the first one that has so much information pops in at about the 10-minute mark after you've already learned most of the controls and been through 2 or 3 combat scenarios. So it teaches you way too much, way too fast, way too late. Game designers should always try and strive to convey their mechanics through the gameplay and narrative. The controls are pretty clunky. They're better than previous Resident Evils, but this sort of leads me to talk about my biggest problem with this game is it's more of a holdover from the classic survival horror Resident Evils by giving the players a slow control scheme that's kind of unresponsive and a little hard to use. It disempowers the player. This works awesome in the context of survival horror, but Resident Evil 4 is sort of a mashup between survival horror and action, and that's the biggest problem this game has. It's an identity crisis. Resident Evils 1 through 3 were survival horrors. 5 and 6 were action games. 4 tries to bridge the gap by combining the two as a transitional phase. Those two genres are kind of diametrically opposed. Survival horror thrives on disempowering the player, trying to get them to avoid conflict at all costs, whereas action revels in giving the player as much power as possible, and to go and try and find as much conflict. And that's the thing. Resident Evil 4 starts out very survival horror-y. You're up against large mobs of enemies that can easily overpower you, you have very little ammo, you have to be very tactical about how you approach situations. But later on in the game, it just goes balls to the walls of action and it just doesn't care. It does not know if it wants to be survival horror or action, it tries to do both at the same time. And I think in that regard, it fails, because it can't really do either terribly well. There's some legitimately stressful situations in this game. Like, for example, I was trapped in this cage, surrounded by a bunch of guys with crossbows, while there was this big, heavy claw guy in the cage with me that I couldn't escape. That was awesome, because it was incredibly stressful. That was great for survival horror, but for action, that just disempowered me. Whereas later in the game, there's a situation where you have to run through so many cultists in this big sort of action movie scene, and it just has a jarring contrast between the two, and it doesn't really work. The game takes an over-the-shoulder sort of third-person view. I'm not a huge fan of this. It works in the context of the game, and it doesn't really interfere, but I feel that Leon takes up a bit too much of the camera's real estate. It's hard to see where certain enemies might be just because Leon gets in the way. The next biggest mechanic is probably the second biggest problem I have with this game: escort quests. Leon is out to rescue the president's daughter, Ashley, and let me tell you, Ashley is a lemon. I might need to give context to that statement. See, while I was playing the game, I created a metagame. I was comparing the situation and how I would prefer to be guarding a literal lemon than Ashley. The lemon won out by 4 main points. A lemon knows when to shut up. The fact is Ashley is just kind of whiny and loud. A lemon knows how to fight in combat. Worst case scenario, you can spray lemon juice in the monster's eyes and run, and know that you at least irritated them to some degree. Ashley, her total amount of use in combat is to bend down, cower, pop up in front of Leon's bullets, instantly killing her like a shooting gallery duck with a death wish. It's kind of obnoxious. At least give her a gun or something. I get that she doesn't have any real training in weapons or anything, but still. I think in that situation, you could have at least given her like a stick or something that didn't make her entirely useless. A lemon doesn't get captured several times throughout the plot. I think Ashley gets captured after you rescue her about 3 times. And during those 3 times, all I could think of was, thank God I'm finally through with that. Only to have to go rescue her again. A lemon wouldn't get recaptured because it would be in Leon's freaking pocket. And finally, at the end of the day, you can throw a lemon into a blender and get some delicious juice. You can't throw a girl into a blender. Well, you could, but there'd probably be some human rights group that would get in a huff if you did. The point is, Ashley makes this game kind of annoying. There's a few situations where you can tell her to go hide, but at the same time, that's not really making good use of having her. If you're going to have a second character out there with you, give her a point of being there, instead of just being some arbitrary thing you need to guard. While I'm complaining about Ashley, she also has a very inconsistent amount of health. Now, she has a health bar, and if she gets attacked by certain monsters, she will lose health, and that's fine. But as soon as Leon just as much as brushes up against her, she'll die. I get Leon shouldn't be attacking her, but instant kill just because she got in the way is kind of a harsh punishment in my opinion. Another mechanic worth mentioning is this game has QuickTime events. The problem with QuickTime events is that they remove players from the experience. When you're keeping your eyes peeled for a specific button prompt to appear on screen, it takes you out of the game, and I don't like that, especially considering that they punish you severely and make you go back, redo certain moments just because you missed the prompt. The soundtrack was pretty well done. The music is really ambient until you get into combat, then it gets super tense. The voice acting is really well done, with one very odd exception. I found that the random villagers you run into fairly early on, it sounds like they forgot to do post-processing on the audio clips or something, because it just sounds staticky and just a jarringly low quality compared to everyone else. The aesthetic is kind of bland. Everything looks very dark, kind of dirty, but in the context of the game and the narrative, it works out excellently. Overall, as much as I complain, Resident Evil 4 is an average to good game. It's not the best game ever, by any means or measure, at least in my opinion. But the fact is, it had the potential to be the best game ever. Due to a few sloppy design choices, and just sort of an inconsistent tone in both the mechanics and the story, it just sort of fell apart. Don't get me wrong here, it's a good game, and I'd easily recommend it to anyone who's really interested in history of the GameCube, history of Capcom, history of Resident Evil. You should check it out, because it is good. If you can get past those design flaws, it can be a really fun game. Just don't go into it expecting an awesome action game or an awesome survival horror. It's very much trying to be both. But because it just doesn't know what it wants to be, it sort of can't figure out what it needs to do to be it. You can pick it up on the GameCube, PS2, Xbox 360, PS3, if you're like the one person in the world who owns one, I hear you can pick it up on the Zeebo. Also, I would love to see what that plays like on that thing, because that would fascinate the hell out of me. But in the end, if you have access to it, it's not a terribly expensive game. And I feel many would enjoy it. I maybe not one of them, but I have played a lot worse games that were generally considered really good games by other people. And maybe one day I'll talk about those.